How do I measure risk by maintaining a healthy weight? This chapter is going to give you some information about uh, what impacts how we feel about ourselves. So it kind of ties in with some of the information from the earlier chapters, how we perceive our body, what's healthy for ourselves, really how much influence our appetite has, and what influences our appetite. So when we think about how we feel about our body, it's easy to see what we view as the negative qualities and what we see as the positive qualities might be a little bit more challenging because we as a self-critical individual, as many of us are, will find those things that we don't like about ourselves. And then 10 years later, we'll say, man, I can't believe I was grouchy about what my kneecaps looked like because my kneecaps looked so good 10 years before. So it's interesting how time has an influence to change what we once saw as negative as is actually kind of not the same. We don't see it the same. So what really does influence how you view your body and what you think about as what's healthy? Well, some of that is your personal expectations, and you have a genetic makeup that is very strongly influencing what you will look like and how your body appearance, your structure, your bone structure, your musculature, your height, as well as your weight. Technology in terms of how we um, see things in the media, how we are marketed to a perfect quote individual for models in terms of what we see clothing, for example. And then we have a cultural bias that has changed over time, where in the Renaissance time, it was appearance. If you were full figured, that meant that you had money and that was desirable. Where in the 60s, things kind of changed and the very thin, long, lean look became more culturally acceptable. Body type and frame has some component in how we view or the way that our body is going to be uh, in appearance. Ectomorphs, endomorphs, and mesomorphs. Ectomorphs are the typical model that you see. They're long and extremely lean. Endomorphs tend to be a little bit more triangular shaped, have a little bit of a softer kind of body structure, and mesomorphs tend to have more of a square body or tend to have more musculature, well-defined musculature, and less often body fat. We also have body frame sizes that are based upon our bones, and we determine that by our height and often by the measurement of your wrist to determine your body frame size. So, healthy weight for you, how do you love your body? How do you love your body? Well, you think about what your natural body type and frame size is. If you are a more muscular individual, that long, extremely tall, lean appearance is not going to be realistic or appropriate. So I think one of the things to think about, and I really appreciate in the reading, is to look at what is beyond that and consider how you can feel positive, how you can feel good about who you are and respect for who you are. Realize that there are many ways of uh, there is a wide range of body shapes and sizes, and it's a matter of feeling really what's good to you as an individual. Weight gain is associated with primarily what we consume and how we eat emotionally, how we perhaps eat under, make choices of quick, less nutritious foods when we're under a lot of stress. And boy, I'll tell you, this has been a rough time with staying active, with having to be in confinement with the coronavirus. So lack of physical activity and going in an excessively low caloric diet all are potential causes of weight. And I'm sure you're aware of the risks of overweight and obesity. The risks of obesity are going to be primarily associated with cardiovascular problems. It does impact your medical insurance. It has often a psychological component to it. I teach a class which is called Exercise Management for Chronic Disease and Disability, and many of the chronic diseases are often, as a comorbidity, is depression. And so, as with obesity being a chronic disease, depression, anxiety can be part of that experience for the individual. Person can feel socially discriminated because of obesity. Diabetes and also some cancers, say breast cancer, are also part of that. So students are typically interested in how do you identify a good body structure or body weight. And part of that is determining the best, a good tool is by measuring body composition. And I want to be very clear that body mass index is not a measurement of percent body fat. It's a measurement of health risk that is determined by height and weight. And if you have an individual who, for instance, is a mesomorph, who's extremely muscular, and maybe an athlete, for example, who has a high amount of muscle, the body mass index is going to give information that isn't really going to be an estimate of health risk. Um, this is best for just a general screening tool to identify risk for, as I mentioned, the chronic diseases of heart disease, obesity, uh, cancer. Okay, so this is related more to risk of chronic disease. And as you can have values that are too high, you can also have a value that is low, which is also not desirable because that can be an indication of poor eating habits, of a chronic disease such as cancer, for example, individuals that have had excessive weight loss because of maybe psychological reasons, a chronic disease such as cancer where people are having difficulty maintaining their body weight. That could be a negative reason for having a low BMI. So low BMIs are not necessarily the best. We measure our waist, and that's one of the assignments in the activity for the chapter or for this module, is to also identify, where do I carry my body fat. So there are some values when you measure your body, your waist measurement. If it's excessively large, that indicates that there is excess body fat around the waist, and that is the place that is linked to a bad or a negative cardiovascular blood profile, and that's going to be an elevated low density lipoproteins and have a greater risk for cardiovascular disease. And that's often seen. You'll see people that will have a really big abdominal region, and there's excessive body fat in that abdominal region. That is called omentum. That's the fat layer or fat pad that's associated with the GI tract, the intestines. That is associated with cardiovascular disease risk. It's associated with an increased risk of type 2 diabetes. And so when you measure your abdominal region, it's the smallest area at your waist. If you are a male, you're at risk if you're 35 to 40 inches. You're at risk for disease, chronic disease, if you're a female and you're between 32 and a half and 37. So the women tend to have a little bit smaller waist because of their natural hourglass kind of shape. High risk is over 40 inches for men and over 37 inches for women. That just means that a higher risk for diabetes and cardiovascular disease. There are other ways of assessing body fat. One is by pinching the skin and using a skin fold measure. You need to have a lot of experience doing that because you can the space, the estimations are based upon the place that you measure it, the specific technique that is used. And so that takes a trained individual to do that particular assessment. You can do an underwater weighing. That's an accurate measure. It's determined by how dense you are and how sinkable you are. So if you have more muscle, you're more sinkable. If you have more body fat, fat is less dense and people tend to be better floaters. So underwater weighing is a lab tool that's used. There are laboratory tools that are also used for estimations, and it's based upon one that's very commonly used, sometimes not just in lab, but in health clubs, is the bioelectrical impedance, which is called the BIA. You just got to be really careful with all of these methods. There are protocols that have to be followed. There are skills involved with interpreting and also assessing. But that is really one, assessing body fat is a way of determining if body weight needs to be adjusted. So how does it, and honestly, what we eat is the biggest contribution to our body weight. And it's many times, or the base of how our appetite works is really two hormones. One is ghrelin and one is leptin. And leptin is what makes you feel full. So if you can think of leptin, la 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 la, full la la la, leptin and full, that kind of gets you. Ghrelin is hungry. So when an obese person tends to be more resistance to leptin and might have higher levels of leptin, but the cells are not listening. So a person might feel more hungry. Ghrelin is what makes us hungry, and these two chemicals regulate the normal and healthy body weight. What gets our hormones out of synchronization, what has been really interesting over the past, I don't know, 5-10 years, is we found that not getting enough sleep actually increases that hunger hormone and decreases the full hormone. So getting enough sleep is, what we find is that insufficient sleep can actually influence your appetite. We also know that not having an excessively low calorie intake increases the hunger hormone, or the ghrelin. If you consume a lot of artificial sweeteners or low-fat foods, that tends to stimulate the release of ghrelin, which is the hunger. Exercise increases the responsiveness of your cells to leptin and helps to normalize the hunger and your ability to utilize calories. So exercise is really an important factor, not just in burning in utilizing calories, but also in regulating hunger when it's done consistently. One of the assignments is calculating your energy balance or your energy needs, and there is an equation that's done for men between the ages of 18 to 30. There is a single equation, and for women, it's another equation. And the equation is provided on the slide. I'll just mention, if you're over the age of 31 and you're a female, it's 3.95 times your body weight in, I believe, pounds plus 829. But that equation is in the assignment in the lab manual, or excuse me, in the textbook. You also utilize your an equation, use a factor that accounts for how active you are. So if you are mainly sitting most of the day, your activity factor is much lower than if you are doing heavy exercise or training. And that could be between the range of 1.2 to sedentary, where you sit most of the day, and 2.3 if you're very active doing training for competition. And I would say that would be probably fewer individuals. Most of us will probably be between light, occasionally active 1.4, moderate 1.6, and heavy 1.9. 2.3 should be really reserved for the highly active individuals. So you can determine how many calories that your body needs to maintain its body weight. You also have the assignment of tracking the calories or maintaining, kind of getting an estimation of what your normal intake is. And the recommendation that seems to be the most effective is a weight loss of 1 to 2 pounds per week. Initially, you might have a dramatic weight loss, and then what tends to happen is people tend to plateau after a while, and you'll go after a couple weeks of 1 to 2 pounds per week. To lose 1 to 2 pounds per week, it is approximately a 500 calorie deficit per day, which would be equivalent to 3,500 calories per week, or 1 pound, because 1 pound is the equivalency of approximately 3,500 calories. So to maintain a healthy weight, reducing calories and increasing exercise is a way of reducing, or the combination of low intensity, moderate intensity is most effective for most folks. And we're guideline for if you have a pedometer or a measurement on your phone that you can track your steps. 10,000 steps per day is an approximate goal to strive for, or 30 to 60 minutes of exercise per day. So how do you think about how is it that we can get to the point where we have that balance? Are you regularly making choices that include a variety of foods and natural foods close to from the ground from which they came, or I should say, and are you exercising or moving regularly? Briefly, the information about eating disorders. There's a difference between an eating disorder and a disordered eating. Disordered eating is when you have a lot of kind of a preoccupation. Our slide says preoccupation with food, calories, fat, body weight, and then associated behaviors. And disordered eating is really just being focused. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have an eating disorder. So disordered eating might mean that you're really focused on low-fat foods, or not eating any sugar and decreasing the amount of sugar that you eat. That could be potentially perceived as, if that just is you're consumed with it, would be disordered eating, or not eating lunch, or not eating breakfast every day. Technically could be classified as disordered eating. Eating disorders are more clinically defined and would include the most common: anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, or binge eating disorder. And those three are different than their eating disorders. that have specific characterizations. So anorexia is eating an extremely refusing to eat, really trying to have weight loss, eating very, very, very few calories. An individual who has anorexia has a tremendous fear of becoming fat and don't see in the mirror what other people will see. And it's often associated with a lack of menstruation or amenorrhea in women. Bulimia is associated frequently with binging and or purging, and that would be having 2 binge purge cycles per week for 3 months, using uh, abuse of laxatives, vomiting, abnormally consumed with body weight and size. And binge eating disorder is when someone has an excessive amount of calories in a short amount of time, and that might be a weight loss, a binge eat. There's no purging associated with it, and then having a lot of not eating then for a while. So it's a cycle of excessive eating of calories, and sometimes people will eat tens of thousands of calories and then be very diligent for a period of time. So I just wanted to mention those briefly. So for a first, maintaining a healthy weight, first is find joy in yourself. Find what maybe you can improve on. Is it physical activity? Is it eating healthier, making better choices? Is it perhaps working on sleep? Is it finding other individuals to do the support system that might want to be doing the same thing with you, where you can find a group or a friend that's going to be kind of doing it with you, and work with what you have instead of working with it. In other words, don't expect to be something that you are not genetically made to be. So the weaknesses is, and this is where you kind of look at, do I like to walk? Do I like to ride my bike? Do I like to take my dog out? What is it that I like to do? And how can I make my nutrition, making eating easier by how I shop? Can I make sure that I get a good night's rest, maybe one additional day a week? Can I make that as my starting point? So how can you think better about yourself to live a healthy life? Because once we start to think about ourselves in a positive way, then we know that we have that internal value, that internal worth to make those changes. As soon as we start discounting and say we're not worth it, then our ability to make those positive changes become difficult. It's the why bother. And you are worth the bother. We're all worth that bother. We all have that intrinsic value. So understand, do that. Start to think about the small things that you can start to change. Small steps, and that is what I would like you to think about in terms of your behavior change project on this week.